This show is taped at La Cenne, a space for creation and collaboration. Artists, thinkers, and creators of all stripes tell us what inspires their work, a starting point that takes us into their creative process in their own words. Welcome to Who Inspires You. Kevin Lowe is the founder of Loki, an independent graphic design studio based in Montreal. Kevin previously worked as art director at a number of agencies such as Jetset, Blue Sponge, and Sidley. He currently teaches in the Department of Design and Computation Arts at Concordia University. He's a community organizer, an activist, and is a founding member of the Howl Arts Collective, among others. Kevin, hello.
Hi,
thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
So let me just jump right in and ask you, Kevin, what influences you, who influences you in your work?
Yeah, so when you first talked to me about this and I started thinking about it, I had a really hard time because there are so many different influences, so many different inspirations that I draw from my work. But a common thread, I guess, in what I try and do now and what I've tried to do over a long period of time is working in parallel with social movements, movements for social justice, and not just working for them, but drawing inspiration from them and trying to feed and work in the same vein, in the same direction, and with the same energy that I get from them. In particular, I guess a specific reference being here in Quebec was the 2012 student strike, which was a really marking time for me. It was a year where I think for many people in the city of Montreal, but in Quebec as well, where things just sort of turned upside down, and that was a really inspiring moment for me. So.
There was a lot of iconography that came out of that movement. And
yeah.
You produced a lot of posters.
Yeah, so I mean, I was doing a lot of solidarity work. I mean, I wasn't a student, obviously, at the time, but I was teaching, and education is a strong concern of mine. My politics lined up, obviously, with the politics of the student movement. And so I did a lot of work in solidarity, organized events, organized interventions, protests, participated in all the manifs. At the same time, I think, there was some brilliant art that was being produced as part of that movement, which was as inspiring as well. And even at that point, I remember thinking about what's going to happen after all the sort of cultural material and the material wealth of everyone's experiences. How does that going to get translated into different texts, images, movies, music, etc. That'll keep going on and on for years to come. At the same time, I don't think, although I was very inspired by the art, I was really inspired by the movement itself. And it wasn't so much about looking at specific artifacts that were created out of that as much as just seeing how a social movement can really transform a city, how it can change people's social relations within that city in a really, really, really magical ways, really, And I think the sense of community that was born amongst strangers within neighborhoods, at neighborhood assemblies, and all the different sort of APACs and stuff like that, and how people's relations to each other, to themselves, and to the urban environment as well. We saw, the city became red, quite literally, So all those really dramatic changes that sort of broke us out of the ordinary day-to-day life of a 9-to-5 worker or whatnot, and sort of really challenged people's perceptions, one way or the other, is really something that, I strive to continue to do in my work on a much smaller scale, obviously, but to try and break those sort of patterns of normalization that we tend to feel under a sort of a neoliberal capitalist sort of society. I like to try and find those moments of freedom and moments of escape, moments of community, and try and carry that through with the work that I do, both in terms of the design, but also in terms of organizing and where those designs live in a certain context.
And during the movement, actually, a lot of what was binding people together was the imagery, the iconography, but also slogans were used a lot, and I know you use them in your work.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that really interests me after the sort of main heat of the strike was done, and this is some sort of project I was doing afterwards, was thinking back to that time and thinking about the things that bound us together in the streets, and in facing very, very extreme police repression as well. So there's very physical sentiments that are really embodied in terms of my memory of the strike, from the tear gas, from the police, from that to the sounds and the smells, and one of the things that I thought of as a sort of notion of material culture was the sort of just the sentiment of being in a demonstration, the sentiment of the chants that were screamed and yelled and chorus, etc., and the sort of power that came with that. And so I worked on a series of projects afterwards, which were sort of a material translation of that into a visual form, and those sort of slogans were then translated into visuals, which were then used in a magazine called Fuse magazine. Okay. And so I'd like to see how those things can carry forth, those sort of elements.
And your consciousness of all of these system dominations that are prevalent in our society was really at the basis of your interest for graphic design, wasn't it?
Well, it's almost the other way around, which is kind of funny. I kind of often wonder how, graphic design is often seen as a very commercial profession. It's sort of hand in hand with advertising and everything that's entailed by that, and the sort of culture of mainstream media, et cetera. But what is interesting is that when I started learning about design and learning about it from a critical perspective, and seeing how images were shaped, how messages were constructed, and started seeing the sort of level of manipulation that happens, a bit less in design, but certainly in advertising. Yeah. But then beyond that, also how meaning is really formed through the images that we choose to put out there as designers, and a certain responsibility that's attached with that. And as I started learning more about design, I also started learning more about the sort of underpinnings of commercial communication, and really started feeling uncomfortable with how that was affecting my own life personally, from a really, really personal perspective, and started being able to put names to some of the sort of feelings of depression or isolation or alienation that I might have been feeling. And so I started trying to look at design as a way to actively work against that. And I can't say I found any answers, but...
But so you're using the tools of this the same tools that you contest in a way that are used in commercial advertising. You're using those same tools to criticize.
Yeah, I think I use the same, the tools themselves are I don't think necessarily biased, but it's the way in which they're applied, right? So I try to subvert those things in certain ways and try and communicate in perhaps more honest ways and in more challenging ways and more contestational ways, exactly, than we might see in mainstream design.
You mentioned that you were inspired by a Dutch design group called Experimental Jetset. And can you tell us a little bit more about them?
So they're a small independent design studio as well. They're 3 members, and I've been inspired by their work for a really, really long time. And they do great work in the Netherlands. And I think I've always been maybe falsely, even though I've sort of lived there a little bit, but I've been falsely romanticizing the notion of design within the Dutch context, compared to within a North American context. There's so much value placed in how things are designed in the Netherlands, in Dutch society, and there's a long history and tradition of that. And I think Experimental Jetset's work fits into that. It's not about the sort of efficiency of design necessarily, but design as a sort of almost philosophical practice, and as a way of thinking through making, that I really, really like. And aesthetically, if you guys check out their work, it doesn't look anything like mine. So aesthetically, we're miles apart. But I'd like to think that on a sort of level of why we practice and the process through which we're working and the thinking process, there's a certain rigor and a certain critique as well that carries through in my work and also carries through in their work.
Why do you think that the Dutch have such an incredibly strong and kind of honest approach to design? Does it come from their culture?
Yeah, it's definitely cultural. I definitely not an expert here, so I can just give my opinion. But one thing that I think is interesting, and what Experimental Jetset have raised in their own writing as well, in their own thinking, is that design works in interesting ways in the fact that it's a representation of a certain time or a certain approach to thinking within a culture, and it also helps to shape that. And one of the things about Dutch culture is it's always been a sort of socialist, neo-Marxist sort of approach. It has a strong welfare state. There's a strong emphasis on democracy, and I think if we look back at printing trades and the history of design as a medium of the dissemination of communication in not necessarily a commercial context, but in terms of books, journals, literature, these are all, and newspapers, these are all platforms that are really necessary for the functioning of a strong social democracy. So there was always an investment in that. Whereas I think when design sort of came to a forefront within, let's say, a North American context, it was much more under a commercial guise, as a sort of handmade into advertising and commercial culture.
So now, in having your own design studio, you're bringing in, I guess, your professional work, but how does it meet with your activism, your personal life, and your personal beliefs? How do you get that to work all together?
It's a real challenge. For a long time, I was working in agencies or freelancing for agencies, and I sort of took a Robin Hood mentality to it. All the people I worked with at the agencies were lovely. It's not a critique on that system or those people necessarily, but wasn't something that I really wanted to be doing. But I worked within that context for over 10 years, but I would take the money that I made out of those projects and those jobs and put that into independent projects that I was pushing of a more personal or a more activist nature. At a certain point, though, it just became untenable for my own sort of mental health and my own sort of just the amount of time that I was doing as well, in terms of having a day job and a night job in that sense. And finally, last year, we launched Loki as an actual studio practice, which really tries to bring all these sort of facets together. So I have the experience of working within professional communication context at advertising agencies, et cetera, communications agencies, interactive agencies. But then I've also got a long-standing experience of working within grassroots activism. And in my mind, there is hopefully a way in which I can make a decent enough living helping out and doing work for causes and for projects that I believe in. And also in doing that, working not for them, but with them. And I think that's sort of that shift in terms of when you're working in an agency context, a lot of times I'm working for someone. Here I really feel like I want to be working in collaboration with my clients, partners, and to be invested in those projects as well because I care about them, and I feel better work comes out of that from that experience. In terms of making it sustainable, that's still a challenge every day, but I do believe it's possible and I'm pretty optimistic about it.
I imagine that, though, that after you start working in graphic design year over year, year after year, you're having to kind of renew what you're doing. How do you do that in, I guess, staying connected to the history of graphic design, using those references, but renewing them, reinterpreting them? How do you do that?
I like to think of graphic design as a language, and a language that evolves over time. So there's on one end you probably have on the negative side maybe the idea of cliches that become overused and symbols that are for example within an activist context a fist in the air or whatnot and that's one aspect of that. But there's also the importance of a collective memory that is around these sorts of symbols. So it's about knowing sort of what aspects to hold on to and what sort of to move forward with. On a really practical level, the internet helps a lot to see new things. There's cycles and trends and all these sorts of things, and understanding how trends work is a big part of my job, be it in fashion, be it in music, and be it in design itself. And it's really just being interested in culture and what's being produced by people younger than myself most of the time, and trying to see what connects with people. So there's that aspect of it, is always taking in culture and sort of trying to figure out what is contemporary and what works while still holding on to the sort of the strong myths that hold us together as people from the past. And then at the same time, I think everyone will probably say it, but sometimes it's good to just disconnect for a big amount of time to let sort of space for yourself to figure out what it is that you want to be saying. And I think that's a hard thing to do in this culture and this society, but it's something that I hope to do a bit more in the future, is just to get away for a while and be able to find your own voice within all that stuff that's being
all that
produced.
noise.
All that noise,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Do you find that working with clients is it's easy to still have your own voice in your work?
I don't think in terms of the work that the studio produces that I have a set sort of style aesthetically. And it sort of goes back to what I was saying about experimental Jetset in the sense that although I find aesthetics really, really important, I don't find necessarily that I'm trying to define my voice stylistically in a certain sense, you know?
Kevin, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.